Okay, take a moment and just, picture it. I'm sure you know the image instantly.
Oh, absolutely.
You see it everywhere, whether you're looking at a priceless piece in a museum or, I don't know, some iconic piece of 20th-century design.
Mhm.
These black horizontal and vertical lines, they're intersecting at perfect right angles, carving up a white canvas.
Mhm.
And then it's just punctuated by these perfect blocks of red, yellow, and blue.
It is probably the most instantly recognizable yet profoundly radical aesthetic in all of modern art.
Exactly.
I mean, it really is the ultimate visual shorthand for modernism itself. It's so clean, so rigorous.
Almost machine-like in its precision.
It is. But the question that immediately, springs up for anyone looking at it is how? How did the man who created this universally recognizable abstract language actually get there?
Right, because he didn't start that way.
Not at all. He didn't begin as some minimalist philosopher working in a sterile Manhattan studio. He started his life and his career as a gentle Dutch landscape painter.
Just drawing windmills and cows?
Exactly. And the journey from point A to point B is, well, it's arguably one of the most compelling and contradictory stories in art history.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the fascinating, contradictory, and deeply spiritual life of Piet Mondrian.
Born Peter Cornelis Mondrian in 1872, lived until 1944.
And he is, without a doubt, one of the greatest pioneers of 20th-century abstract art. So our mission here is pretty simple.
Yeah.
We want to trace his dramatic artistic evolution, try to understand the surprising spiritual beliefs that drove his whole quest for these universal values.
And then finally, maybe reveal some of the intensely human and sometimes ridiculous truths about his personal world.
Definitely.
So to set the stage, we really should arm you with the essential vocabulary, because Mondrian wasn't just, painting pictures. He was building a whole philosophical system.
Right.
He co-founded this revolutionary artistic movement called the Stijl.
The Stijl, and that translates to...
That's the style. Very direct. But his personal theory, the one that gave us the grids, was Neoplasticism.
Right, Neoplasticism, the new pure plastic art, as he called it.
Exactly. And this whole project, this entire life's work, was driven by a really powerful, almost religious utopian concern for finding universal aesthetics, art that could transcend the specific, messy details of our day-to-day reality.
And the core artistic vocabulary he finally settled on is almost shocking in how sparse it is, especially when you think about the complex philosophies behind it.
It's incredible. He famously reduced his entire creative world, his whole canvas, down to just 3 core elements.
Just 3.
Precisely. First, you've got the 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow.
Okay.
Second, the 3 primary values, black, white, and gray, although later on he really minimized the use of gray.
Okay.
And finally, the 2 primary directions, the horizontal and the vertical. That's it. That's the entire toolkit.
And he believed that was enough.
He believed that the dynamic, harmonious balance of just those elements was enough to capture the rhythm and the foundation of the entire universe. It's just a remarkable declaration of intent for any artist, let alone one working in the early 20th century.
That intense, almost ascetic reduction of the world down to 9 rules, 3 colors, 3 values, 2 directions. It couldn't have just happened spontaneously.
No, not at all.
To really appreciate the grids, I feel like you have to understand the gentle, familiar world he was trying to escape from.
That's exactly right. Piet Mondrian was born in Amersfoort in the Netherlands in 1872. He grew up in a family where art and a pretty rigid education were central.
His father was a drawing teacher, right?
The qualified drawing teacher, yes. Which meant Piet was introduced to drawing and painting from a very, very early age. The family later moved to Winterswijk, and his uncle, Frits Mondrian,
Of the Hague School.
of the esteemed Hague School of Artists, he also played a huge role in his training.
And the Hague School was known for its deep, almost romantic engagement with the Dutch landscape. So we're talking misty, atmospheric, very descriptive painting.
Very much so. And after a strict Protestant upbringing, Mondrian initially took the practical path. He qualified as a primary education teacher.
But that didn't last?
No. By 1892, his true passion won out, and he entered the Academy for Fine Art in Amsterdam.
So if you look at his work from this period, say between 1895 and 1905, it's completely unrecognizable if you only know his later stuff.
Absolutely. Most of his initial work was naturalistic or impressionistic. He was painting those iconic pastoral Dutch landscapes.
Windmills, flat fields, rivers.
All of it. quiet domestic life. He was still very much a student of his environment and, his predecessors.
But even then, even in this early period, you can kind of see him constantly searching for his own voice.
Oh, for sure. He was experimenting, absorbing lessons from contemporary European art. You can trace the influence of techniques like pointillism.
Breaking color down into dots.
Right, and also the vivid emotional colors of fauvism, which he started to bring into his work around 1908.
And this period of intense experimentation is so clear in pieces like The Red Mill or Trees and Moonrise. They're firmly post-impressionist.
But here's where the trajectory really starts to bend toward the future. Even when he was painting a specific object, a tree or a mill, he started to prioritize color and structure over just, describing it.
You can really see that in the pivotal work Evening, Red Tree from 1908.
Yes.
It's definitely still a tree in a field at dusk. It's rooted in nature. But that palette, it's almost entirely deep reds, blues, and yellows.
The form is still there, but the colors are already announcing that primary color obsession that would define neoplasticism a decade later.
It's like an early warning sign.
It's an early augur, yeah.
Yeah.
Signaling that he was starting to treat color as this independent force.
And there's this crucial transitional phase from about 1905 to 1908 leading up to that piece.
There is. His canvases started depicting these dim, almost indistinct scenes. The trees and reflections in still water, they start to become almost ghost-like.
So you're forced to focus less on, oh, what kind of tree is that?
And more on the structural balance, the shapes, the way the light dissolves the specific content. This is his first big structural shift toward abstraction. And it's driven by this internal, profound need for simplification.
And this need for simplification, it wasn't just an aesthetic choice, was it? It was profoundly spiritual. And this feels like the absolute linchpin of his entire career.
It is. This is the key insight that distinguishes Mondrian from so many of his abstract contemporaries. His art was intimately and structurally related to his spiritual and philosophical studies.
Right.
In 1908, he became deeply interested in theosophy.
Which was a spiritual movement started by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky in the late 19th century.
That's the one. And he officially joined the Dutch branch of the Theosophical Society in 1909.
So for listeners who might have heard the name theosophy but aren't sure of the details, what were the core ideas that so fundamentally shifted Mondrian's painting?
Well, at its heart, Blavatsky's theosophy, especially as she laid it out in her big work, The Secret Doctrine, believed that a profound, unifying knowledge of nature was attainable. But, and this is the crucial part, it was beyond empirical means.
Meaning you couldn't find universal truth just by looking at the world.
Exactly. You had to look past it. And Mondrian just bought into this completely. He even stated later in 1918, I got everything from The Secret Doctrine.
Wow. So his mission as a painter then becomes spiritual revelation, not just visual description.
Precisely. He wasn't aiming to paint what he saw anymore, but to paint the underlying cosmic balance that organized what he saw.
And this philosophical stance leads him directly to the grid.
Directly. He proclaimed in 1914 that art is higher than reality and has no direct relation to reality. And if reality is messy and temporary and specific,
then the spiritual truth must be the opposite. Pure, timeless, universal.
Exactly. He argued, to approach the spiritual in art, one will make as little use as possible of reality because reality is opposed to the spiritual.
That provides the fundamental why behind the grids. The specific image of, say, a Dutch windmill is a limitation because it restricts the spiritual idea to one place, one time.
And this links directly to the horizontal and vertical lines. Theosophy, and later anthroposophy, which he also followed, they often dealt in these grand dualities.
Masculine and feminine, spirit and matter.
Right, the static and the dynamic. The vertical line, representing the spiritual, often stood in opposition to the horizontal line, which represented the material earth. His entire quest was to find a perfect, dynamic equilibrium between these two fundamental forces.
So the grid, it's not a simple design. It's a diagram of cosmic harmony.
It is. That adds massive weight to those simple lines, doesn't it?
It really does. They're not just aesthetic choices. They are a diagram of duality. And that connection, it just remains central to him for his whole life.
Absolutely. Even as late as 1921, he wrote that his neoplasticism was the art of the foreseeable future for all true anthroposophists and theosophists. For Mondrian, abstraction wasn't a choice, it was a spiritual necessity. It was dictated by his search for that pure, universal spirit that just couldn't be contained by representational art.
The spiritual drive was clearly there. It was established in Amsterdam. But to get the technical tools he needed to achieve that spiritual goal, He had to go to the center of the technical revolution.
which meant Paris.
Of course. So in 1912, Mondrian takes that critical step and moves to the City of Light.
And this was a very deliberate attempt to just immerse himself in the European avant-garde. He even made a symbolic gesture to sort of shed his Dutch provincialism.
He dropped the second A from Mondrian.
He did. He officially became Piet Mondrian. He was signaling his rebirth as a modern artist.
And what he found there immediately was Cubism, primarily through the work of Picasso and Georges Braque, who were just fracturing the traditional picture plane.
And what's fascinating is how quickly he absorbed it and then synthesized it for his own purposes. In his first Parisian works, like The Sea from 1912 and his various tree studies, you see the immediate application of geometric shapes, these interlocking planes.
And a really reduced, almost monochromatic palette, lots of grays and ochres.
Yeah. He went from those soft, evocative colors of his theosophy-inspired period straight into the highly structured but still representational hard lines of Cubism.
But he saw it as a stop along the way, right?
He did. He viewed it as a crucial port of call on his journey, but not the final destination. Cubism was necessary because it showed him how to break down the natural world into its geometric components.
But he felt it didn't go far enough.
Exactly. Mondrian argued that because Cubism still held on to recognizable forms, a guitar, a bottle, a face, it was still tied to representation. And he was after total pure abstraction. He needed to keep the structure and just throw out the subject.
You could see that intellectual process of simplification so clearly when you look at how he treated the same subject over multiple years, like the two famous versions of Still Off with Ginger Pot.
Oh, that's a perfect example. The 1911 version, painted just before he went to Paris, is definitely indebted to Cubism. You see fractured objects, but they're still recognizably a pot, a table.
But then you look at the 1912 version, painted once he was fully immersed in Paris.
It's night and day. The objects are radically reduced to just geometric shapes, a round form, some triangles, rectangles. He's taking the cubist structure and just stripping the representation right out of it, moving toward a purer form of visual organization.
But his time in Paris was cut short.
It was. While he was visiting his family back in the Netherlands in 1914, World War I broke out. Travel back to France became impossible.
So he was effectively stuck in his home country for 4 years.
And this wartime detention, it actually turned out to be incredibly fruitful for his philosophical development and for collaboration. He ended up at the Lorraine Artists' Colony,
where he met two really crucial figures who were also pushing the boundaries of abstraction, Bart van der Lek and Theo van Doesburg.
Van der Lek's influence seems just massive, especially when it comes to his color choices.
It was decisive. Van der Lek was already using only primary colors in his art, along with black, white, and gray. Mondrian later wrote that his own technique, which he admitted was still more or less cubist, came under the influence of his precise method.
So meeting van der Lek basically solidified Mondrian's limited palette. It got rid of any remaining vestiges of, greens or purples from his work.
And then together with Theo van Doesburg, they co-founded the Stijl movement and its journal in 1917.
Which became the intellectual platform for his revolution. It was in that journal that he first published essays defining his mature theory, Neoplasticism, in a series of installments called The New Visualization in Painting.
This was his first big attempt to define his art not just in paint, but with rigorous philosophical language.
And the foundational philosophy for everything that followed is maybe best summed up in a quote from a letter he wrote in 1914. He said, "I construct lines and color combinations on a flat surface in order to express general beauty with the utmost awareness."
He's so particular about the process there. It has to be deliberate, not emotional. He says nature inspires an emotional state, but he wants to abstract everything from that until I reach the foundation of things.
Right. It sounds less like painting and more like applied mathematics or philosophy.
It really does.
And this abstraction wasn't meant to be chaotic. He believed that by using only horizontal and vertical lines, constructed with awareness, not random impulse, but led by high intuition, and brought to harmony and rhythm, these basic forms could become a work of art that was as strong as it is true.
He seems to be consciously channeling that classical Platonic Euclidean worldview, the search for eternal perfect forms.
And the horizontal and the vertical become his only tools to achieve this perfect, stable, dynamic balance. For the next 2 decades, this rigid, self-imposed restriction became his entire method. He understood that by limiting his expressive palette, he actually gave himself universal expressive potential. It was the foundation of his new vision.
So when World War I finally ends, Mondrian immediately goes back to Paris in 1918. He finds a continent that's been devastated by conflict but is also buzzing with new ideas.
And he immediately flourished. He fully embraced the art of pure abstraction for the rest of his life. He had arrived at his philosophical destination, the grid.
And he believed this pure abstract art was completely emancipated, free of naturalistic adherences.
Right. And that realizing these equivalent relationships, the perfect balance between line and color, horizontal and vertical, was of the highest importance for life.
So it's a utopian vision. If art could achieve perfect harmony, then maybe society could follow.
That was the idea. He started producing these grid-based paintings in late 1919, but his iconic, definitive style, the one we all instantly recognize, that emerged in a subtle but really crucial evolution between 1920 and 1921.
Okay, let's track that evolution because the differences are pretty profound when you look closely.
They really are. In the earliest grids of 1919, the lines were thin and often gray, not that solid black we associate with him.
And crucially, they often faded as they approached the canvas edge, right?
Yeah.
They didn't go all the way.
Exactly. They didn't continue to the frame, and the forms themselves were smaller, more numerous, and almost all of them were colored. There's very little pure white space.
So a lot of color, and the lines felt almost tentative, fading out.
That's a good way to put it. But by late 1920 and into 1921, we arrive at the look that defined the next 2 decades. The lines became thick and black, immediately establishing this powerful, flat geometry.
And the forms were larger and fewer, with a deliberate emphasis on white space.
And over time, he started extending all of the black lines completely to the edges of the canvas. This gives this strong visual impression that the composition doesn't end at the frame.
Right, it feels like it continues indefinitely, like a fragment of an infinite universal structure.
And that concept of the canvas being a fragment of something eternal is perfectly illustrated by the lozenge paintings he started doing in the mid-1920s.
These were square canvases that were physically tilted 45 degrees into a diamond shape.
The lozenge format is so important because it intentionally disrupts the conventional horizontal and vertical orientation of the wall or the easel. A classic example is Schilder's No. 1, lozenge with 2 lines and blue from 1926.
This is incredibly minimal canvas.
Terrifyingly minimal. It's just 2 black perpendicular lines and a tiny blue triangular form in one corner. By tilting the canvas, he took the vertical and horizontal, which represent stability, and placed them diagonally within the frame. It forces a whole new kind of dynamic tension.
It really reinforces that feeling that what you're seeing is just a cutout of an infinite, harmonized universal order. It's an intellectual exercise as much as it is an artistic one.
And this is where we need to get into a crucial technical detail, a sort of how-to insight that completely changes how you view these paintings.
Okay.
When you look at a Mondrian, you often assume they're perfectly flat planes of uniform color, almost like they were machine-made to achieve this ultimate purity.
But up close, they're not like that at all.
Not at all. They reveal subtle brush strokes, which indicates a very deliberate, nuanced technique that was designed to create specific visual effects.
That's a surprising contradiction.
Yeah.
The artist who's striving for universal purity through geometric flatness is actually introducing texture and depth with his painting method.
He is. If you look closely, you see he used different techniques for different elements. First, the black lines are generally the flattest parts, with the least amount of built-up paint or texture. They're meant to be absolute boundaries. Second, the colored forms, the red, yellow, and blue. They have obvious brushstrokes, but they're all applied directionally, running uniformly in one direction.
But the white forms are the most interesting, and that's where the real spiritual work seems to be happening.
They absolutely are. Mondrian painted the white forms in layers using brushstrokes that run in different, often perpendicular directions.
And this seemingly small technical detail has a huge visual consequence.
Massive. It generates a far greater sense of physical depth and complexity in the white space compared to the flat lines or the directional color blocks.
So he was literally sculpting spiritual depth into the surface, using paint strokes to contradict the flatness of the geometry. The white space is not just negative space, it's not just a background.
That's the crucial conclusion. The layering means the white space appears to visually overwhelm the lines and the colors. It looks deeper, thicker, more active than the forms it contains.
Which lines up perfectly with his evolving preference for using more and more white space. The white is the most complex, layered, and deep element.
It's the spiritual void waiting to be filled by harmony.
That's a revelation. The quest for the pure, universal spirit beneath reality translated literally into layering white paint until it gained 3-dimensional depth. He wasn't just simplifying, He was using complexity to give the impression of infinite purity.
And his work was starting to get global recognition during this period. In 1926, Catherine Dreyer, who was a key figure in promoting modernism in America, acquired one of his diamond compositions, Painting Eye.
And she exhibited it at the Brooklyn Museum. This was part of the first major exhibition of modern art in America since the famous 1913 Armory Show.
Right, which introduced radical European modernism to American audiences for the first time.
And Dreyer didn't hold back about its importance. She publicly stated that Holland had produced three great painters, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and Mondrian.
That's positioning him not just as a contemporary master, but as a historical icon. It really solidified his position globally.
And as the 1930s went on in Paris, his work continued this rigorous, subtle evolution.
It did. Lines began to take precedence over forms again. He started using thinner lines and, crucially, began introducing double lines more frequently, an element that's often attributed to the influence of his friend and contemporary, the artist Marlowe Mauss.
But a double line seems like it introduces hierarchy and complexity, which kind of flies in the face of his quest for ultimate purity. How did he justify that departure from his own rules?
He argued that the double line offered his paintings a new dynamism that he was eager to explore. By creating parallel lines, he introduced a sense of clustered energy and movement that the single line just couldn't provide.
So this relentless search for dynamism, even within his tightly restricted geometric custom, shows that his evolution never really stopped.
Never. Even when the style became highly recognizable, he was never satisfied with the static perfection.
This era of subtle evolution in Paris was, well, violently interrupted by the advance of fascism in Europe. In September 1938, Mondrian fled Paris for London.
And 2 years later, as the war intensified and the threat grew, he left London aboard the RMS Samaria for Manhattan, New York City, where he'd stay until his death.
And this move, driven by global catastrophe, triggered one of the most profound and, I would say, joyous stylistic shifts of his entire career.
Oh, completely. New York, with its energy, its towering geometry, and most importantly, its vibrant jazz scene, it just unlocked a new level of dynamism in his work.
You can see that transition so clearly in what are called his transatlantic paintings.
Right. Canvases he started in Europe and then completed months or years later in New York, like Composition Number 12.
The finished works from this period are visually busy. They have more lines than any of his works since the early 1920s, and they're often in this overlapping arrangement that almost looks like a map of a new city.
And it was here, in the high energy of New York, that the innovation of colored lines finally took center stage. He completely abandoned the black boundary.
He had done one simple painting back in 1933, lozenge composition, with 4 yellow lines, using thick colored lines instead of black.
He had, but that practice had remained dormant until he arrived in Manhattan.
And then he embraced it with revolutionary fervor in the U.S. You look at works like Composition, 1938, Place de la Concorde, 1943, and you can literally see him taking these unfinished black line paintings from Paris.
The rigid, controlled structure.
And completing them in New York by adding these short perpendicular lines of different colors.
This changes the visual language entirely. The new colored areas are thick, almost bridging the gap between lines and forms, and suddenly you have pure color that's completely unbounded by black.
The color isn't contained by the line anymore. The color is the structure, moving freely across the plane.
It's the closest he ever came to painting pure energy.
And this transition leads directly to his final, most revolutionary idiom, the boogie-woogie style. An idiom that was just tragically cut short after only a few years by his death.
The name itself says so much, doesn't it? It reflects the upbeat, syncopated rhythm of the jazz music and the vibrant, vertical energy of the city that inspired him.
The austerity of the spiritual grid just gives way to the chaotic, yet structured rhythm of the modern city.
That move from philosophical purity to kinetic rhythm is just astonishing.
It is. And the masterpieces of this period are Broadway Boogie Woogie and the unfinished masterpiece, Victory Boogie Woogie. The technique he pioneered here is nothing short of radical in its simplicity and effectiveness.
He replaced the solid black lines entirely with lines that were created from small, adjoining rectangles of color. And he often created them using small pieces of colored paper tape.
He moved away from the painter's brush to the designer's cutout element.
Exactly.
And the use of colored paper tape is such a fascinating technical detail. It gives the lines this pulsating, flickering quality that solid paint could never achieve. It feels like the rhythm of neon signs and taxicabs flashing by.
It does. And in these final works, the small kinetic forms have definitively usurped the authoritative role of the solid black lines. The resulting lattice of flickering color imparts this wholly new sense of depth and movement. It's almost vibrating off the canvas.
It represents the most profound stylistic development in his work since he abandoned representational art back in 1913.
A final, joyful revolution driven by the music and energy of New York.
And speaking of surprising technical details and fragility, we have to mention the famous upside-down mystery concerning the 1941 work New York City of Owl.
Yes.
This painting also used those removable strips of painted paper tape.
Right. And in 2022, there was this startling discovery that the work, which is held in a German gallery, the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen, has been displayed upside down since at least 1980.
Since 1980. How did they figure that out?
Art historians analyzing his process realized that the concentration of horizontal colored strips, which often represented the movement of the street or a river, should be at the top of the canvas, symbolizing the beginning of the city structure.
And yet, it was displayed the other way around for decades, with the strips all pooling at the bottom. So what's the official word now? Did the gallery fix it?
No, the gallery explained that they would continue to display it the wrong way up to avoid damaging the extremely fragile strips of paper tape, which had settled in their current orientation over decades. They feared that repositioning the canvas now could cause the tape to detach.
Wow, what a profound irony. The greatest, most disciplined abstract geometrist in history created work so physically fragile that its intended orientation, its structural balance, has been sacrificed for its physical preservation.
A testament to how fragile even the most seemingly rigid perfection can be.
So when you look at those paintings, the absolute order, the extreme discipline, that Platonic search for universal harmony, you assume the artist must have been an equally ordered, disciplined, maybe even cold man.
And this is where the deep dive into the sources reveals this wonderful, often deeply human contradiction.
He was, by all accounts, intensely eccentric. I read one critic who described him as someone who lived like an ambassador from the kingdom of ridiculous notions.
And someone who had no sense of humor and rarely smiled. He really committed to his austerity.
He lived almost like a monk.
He did. He never married or had any long-lasting romantic relationships. He believed they inevitably obstructed his work and led to unnecessary obligations. He lived alone, surviving largely on this minimalist diet of lentils and coffee.
And in his studios, he often refused to have standard furniture, right? He built his own.
Built his own severe right-angled tables and chairs out of discarded fruit crates. The environment had to match the canvas.
It sounds like an intense control freak.
He was. And his eccentricities extended into these bizarre fears and dietary quirks, which are almost comical against the backdrop of his profound artistic seriousness.
We know he was a follower of theosophy, but he also followed phrenology.
Yes, the now discredited pseudoscience that claimed you could determine character and intelligence by studying the shape and bumps on a person's skull.
So he was looking for universal structure, not just in the cosmos, but in the contours of the human head.
Exactly. And his list of fears was long and peculiar. He stuck to these strange fad diets, notably refusing to use ice cubes because he believed that cold food was bad for the health.
But his physical fears were even more intense.
He was extremely afraid of eye injuries, even refusing to play games with his brothers as a child.
Wait, a pioneer of visual art was deathly afraid of damaging his vision. That just introduces this layer of existential anxiety to his entire output.
It really does. And he was also profoundly afraid of spiders.
Oh.
There's one truly memorable anecdote that perfectly captures this man of intense control just completely losing it.
Oh, this I have to hear.
He once fell asleep during a concert, woke up, spotted a spider on his clothing, and started screaming loudly, disrupting the entire performance.
You're kidding. This puritanical pioneer of modern art started screaming in the middle of a symphony.
That's the story.
That contrast, the absolute control required for the grid versus this primal, almost childish terror of a spider, it just highlights the tension in his internal life.
It connects to the bigger picture. You have this man of absolute, almost fearful control and isolation, living the most rigid existence possible to achieve universal truth on the canvas.
Which makes his secret, lifelong passion the ultimate glorious contradiction.
It really is. This solitary man who lived on lentils and crates, searching for static purity, was a committed and passionate dancer.
He was a regular dancer from his early days in Amsterdam onward.
Even in the isolation of the Lorraine artists' colony when he was trapped during World War I, he danced waltzes and tangos. though observers noted he did so very slowly, keeping his body almost totally rigid.
That sounds less like a passionate expression and more like performance art based on his paintings. A rigid vertical figure moving across a floor.
A controlled movement, for sure, but he adapted as he moved through the modern world. When he got back to Paris, he embraced the chaos and spontaneity of jazz and the Charleston. He took friends out to hot spots like the Jungle Bar and the Petit Teddy.
So the man who banished all trace of human emotion and movement from his canvas was actively seeking out the raw, syncopated rhythm of jazz in his personal time.
And this wasn't just a youthful phase. Even when he fled fascism and was living in North London in 1939, not exactly a booming jazz scene, he would still wander down to Camden Town to dance at places like the Camden Palace.
Amazing.
And right before his 70th birthday in New York, he celebrated his recovery from a long bout of rheumatism with a wild night out at Cafe Society.
This raises a really important question. If the grid was his spiritual architecture, his attempt to freeze the universe into this perfect static balance, then maybe the chaotic, joyful rhythm of dancing was the necessary dynamism and life force that he suppressed everywhere else.
His personal pressure release valve?
Exactly.
I think the dynamism he eventually allowed into his final paintings, the boogie-woogie works, was arguably first rehearsed on the dance floor. The tension between his intellectual pursuit of purity and his physical craving for rhythm perfectly explains the two sides of his genius.
And that profound contradiction between his rigid persona and his deep spiritual yearning, it really finds its synthesis in how he created his studio spaces.
Oh, absolutely. Mondrian used his studios in Paris, London, and Manhattan as these dynamic, nurturing environments that were themselves works of art, or maybe architectural blueprints.
He essentially treated the studio walls as a massive three-dimensional extension of his canvas.
He did. In Paris, to hide the studio's structural flaws and the, chaotic reality of the walls, he would tack up these large rectangular placards of single colors or neutral tones. Then he'd add smaller colored paper squares and rectangles to accent the walls, constantly repositioning them.
It sounds almost like a modern digital design process, like constantly rearranging elements on a mood board or a screen until the composition finds its perfect balance.
That's an excellent parallel. He established this creative schedule where a period of intense painting would alternate with a period of experimentally regrouping the smaller colored cutouts on the walls.
So the process of arranging and rearranging the colored elements
Yeah.
directly fed the next period of painting.
It was a pattern he followed for the rest of his life. He turned his living space into an active laboratory for neoplasticism.
And when he arrived in Manhattan in 1943, he created his final definitive studio at 15 East 59th Street.
Meticulously designed it himself. He painted the high walls off-white and built his own self-designed furniture from those fruit crates.
Visitors to this last studio often said that while there were few new canvases, the 8 large compositions of colored bits of paper he had tacked to the walls created an environment that was, paradoxically, both kinetic and serene.
Stimulating and restful, Mondrian himself declared it the best space he had ever inhabited. His vision of total lived harmony finally realized.
And when he died so suddenly of pneumonia in February 1944, this environment was instantly recognized as a legacy in itself.
Yes, his friend and sponsor, the artist Harry Holtzman, who was his heir, along with another painter friend, Fritz Glarner, carefully documented and traced these wall compositions.
Which was a crucial act of preservation.
They created these portable wall works, or facsimiles, by carefully affixing the original surviving cutout components to trace copies of the walls. And these portable wall works have since been exhibited internationally, giving us this rare insight into the final dynamic phase of his creative process, a phase that was literally merging art, architecture, and life.
Before we discuss his monumental legacy in the wider world, we should also acknowledge his other, more figurative art that he kind of kept secret, the flower paintings.
Right. Mondrian continued to paint figurative works, creating these delicate portraits of individual flowers. He blended his strict academic training with what critics argue were his subconscious spiritual and romantic yearnings.
He painted these in a secretive manner into the 1920s, often claiming they were just for commercial reasons, a way to earn money without compromising his abstract work.
Which suggests this profound tension. He was intellectually committed to abstraction, rejecting nature, yet he needed the commercial safety net and maybe the emotional outlet that painting these individual specific blooms provided. It's the one clear artistic concession he made to reality.
It contributes to a broader, richer view of his life that's very different from the traditional narrative of pure, cold artistic evolution.
It does. However, his enduring legacy in the realm of pure abstraction is just undeniable. The influential critic Robert Hughes described him as one of the supreme artists of the 20th century and a totem for everything modernism set out to be.
And that artistic acclaim translates to enormous market value, proving the longevity of his vision. Recent auction sales have been just astronomical.
In 2022, Composition No. 2 sold at Sotheby's for $51 million.
And another piece, Composition with Large Red Plane, fetched $47.6 million in 2025.
We should also note a more sobering aspect of his legacy, which speaks to the historical upheaval he endured. The ongoing lawsuits filed by his heirs seeking the return of 4 paintings from Germany and Composition with Blue from the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
All of which had been seized by the Nazis during the war.
Yes.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Mondrian's utopian vision didn't just stay within the gallery walls, did it? It just exploded into global culture in every possible way, proving his own concept that his art was universal and scalable.
The ubiquity is astounding. In fashion, you have Yves Saint Laurent's iconic 1965 Mondrian collection of shift dresses, which instantly brought high art to mass consumption.
And Lola Prusak designed luggage for Hermès in the 1930s with geometric inlays of red, blue, and yellow leather squares.
It extends deep into design and even sport. The La Vie Claire cycling team used Mondrian-inspired designs for their bikes and jerseys in the 80s.
Nike released special edition Dunk Low SB shoes inspired by his paintings. The aesthetic is used on album covers and in technology.
And in technology, his influence is particularly strong because his aesthetic translates so easily into code. There are various software systems named after him for specialized purposes.
Like data visualization systems, Google's code review system.
And even open source OLAP servers, those are the huge, complex analytical systems companies use to analyze massive amounts of business data.
And maybe the most whimsical tribute is the Piet esoteric programming language.
Yes. For listeners unfamiliar, an esoteric language is designed to push the boundaries of computer programming, often for humor or intellectual challenge. In the case of Piet, programs look literally like Mondrian-style abstract art.
So the color boundaries and blocks actually determine the code's function.
It's the ultimate homage. Even urban planning is affected. The building facades of Chunyang Estate, a massive public housing complex in Hong Kong, were consciously inspired by the geometric, horizontal, and vertical elements of his work.
From spiritual quests in a Dutch landscape, through the rhythm of jazz, to public housing architecture in Asia, the reach of those few black lines and 3 colors is just incredible.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, looking to grasp Mondrian quickly but thoroughly? I think his life was defined by this relentless spiritual pursuit of one single, pure idea, that universal beauty and cosmic harmony could be found by stripping away the temporary mess of reality.
He started with careful, descriptive Dutch landscapes, used cubism as a necessary structural launchpad, and then developed the extreme, isolated discipline of neoplasticism.
Only to find a final, kinetic, joyful burst of color and energy inspired by the syncopated rhythms of New York jazz.
He died of pneumonia in New York City in 1944, but the outpouring of respect he received was immense. His memorial service was attended by nearly 200 people,
including fellow artistic revolutionaries like Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, Fernand Léger, and Alexander Calder. It just proves his stature within the global artistic community he'd worked so hard to join.
His legacy is perfectly summarized by Robert Hughes, who reflected that Mondrian was one of the last painters who believed that the conditions of human life could be changed by making pictures.
Think about that as our final provocative thought. What does it mean for a simple, disciplined grid of primary color to hold such massive spiritual and utopian weight?
If Mondrian truly believed that this art, this dynamic balance of opposites, could change the world, then the grid isn't a limitation on expression. It's a blueprint for a better future, a future built on perfect, universal harmony.